People who vanished without a trace. Chapter 1. Introduction. I've worked as a park ranger for the Corvine National Forest for 11 years, and in that time, I've pulled 2 lost hikers off cliff ledges, splinted a broken leg 4 miles from the nearest trailhead, and once talked a grieving widower down from a ridge where he'd gone to die quietly among the trees his wife had loved. I thought I'd seen the full range of what these mountains could do to a person. I was wrong, but it took me a long time to admit that, because admitting it meant accepting something my whole rational mind rebelled against. My name is Callum Reyes, and the station I run sits at the edge of 80,000 acres of old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest, a green ocean of Douglas fir and hemlock that swallows sound the way real oceans swallow light. I love this job in the quiet, unglamorous way you love something that asks everything of you and gives back just enough to keep you coming back. Long solitary patrols, radio static for company, the particular smell of wet bark and pine sap that gets into your clothes so deep you stop noticing it. The forest has always had its share of missing persons. Comes with the territory. 80,000 acres of steep terrain, unpredictable weather, drop-offs that don't show up until you're 3 feet from the edge. Search and rescue trains for it. I'd personally worked 11 search operations over the years, most resolved, a few not. But that October, something changed in the texture of the missing. It started with a hiker named Priya Ramanathan, 31, an experienced backpacker who'd checked in at my station the morning she set out on the Widmark Loop, a well-marked 11-mile trail popular enough that I could practically walk it blind. She was cheerful, prepared, carried a satellite messenger, told me she'd be back by 4. I remember her specifically because she asked about a particular stretch of trail near mile marker 7, wanting to know if the creek crossing there was safe this time of year. Mile 7's fine, I told her. Little slick on the rocks, but nothing you can't manage. Good, she said, smiling, hitching her pack higher. That's the spot everybody talks about anyway. I want to see it for myself. I didn't ask what she meant by that. I wish now that I had. She didn't check in by 4. By 6, with the light going gray and the temperature dropping the way it does, fast in these mountains, once the sun drops behind the ridgeline, I logged her overdue and started the notification chain. By the next morning, we had 6 people combing that 11-mile loop, dogs included, and we found nothing. Not a footprint past mile marker 6. Not a dropped water bottle. Not a snapped branch. Not a single thread caught on brush. The trail simply stopped producing evidence of her at almost exactly the point she'd asked me about. Search and rescue coordinator Delphine Ashcombe, who'd worked these mountains twice as long as I had, stood at that marker with her hands on her hips, studying the empty trail ahead like it might confess something if she stared hard enough. I don't like this stretch, she said, quiet enough that I almost missed it over the wind moving through the canopy above us. Why's that? She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice had gone strange, careful, like she was picking her way across something she didn't fully trust. It's not the first time. This exact marker. I've been doing this a long time, Callum, and I've noticed a pattern I've never told anyone because it sounds insane out loud. That was the first time I felt it. A small, cold seed of wrongness planting itself somewhere behind my ribs, the sense that I'd stepped, without noticing the threshold, into something considerably larger than a missing hiker. Chapter 2. Strange Events. Priya's disappearance should have been the whole story. Instead, it was only the beginning, and the days that followed unraveled in a way that made less sense the harder I looked at them. 3 days after the search was suspended, I pulled the station's old incident logs, going back through decades of paperwork stored in cardboard boxes in the back room, looking for anything resembling Delphine's pattern. What I found made my hands go cold against the brittle old paper. Mile marker 7 on the Widmark loop had swallowed people before. Not constantly. Years would pass with nothing, but the incidents were there if you knew to look for them, buried in old case files under vague language like subject failed to return and search discontinued, insufficient leads. 1987, 1996, 2004, 2011, always someone experienced, always someone who'd specifically asked about that stretch of trail beforehand, always vanishing between markers 6 and 7 with no trace at all. What disturbed me more than the pattern itself was what happened when I tried to pull photographs from the older cases. The physical files were intact, the paperwork legible, but every photograph clipped to those specific reports had degraded in a way that made no sense. Not faded like old film naturally fades, but blurred at the edges in a strange, deliberate way, like something had been smudged out of the frame after the fact. I could make out trees. I could make out the trail. But wherever a person should have stood in each photo, there was only a soft, formless blur, as though the camera itself had refused to record them. I mentioned it to Delphine over coffee at the station the following morning, sliding one of the old photographs across the table toward her. She looked at it for a long moment and set it down without picking it up again. "I've seen that before too," she said. "I used to think it was just old film stock, bad chemicals, whatever. I don't think that anymore. What do you think now?" She didn't answer that either. Instead, she told me something that made the hair rise on my arms. That 18 months after Priya's disappearance would mark exactly the anniversary of the last one, a solo hiker named Grant Oyalaren, and that, if the pattern held, the mountains were nowhere near finished. I started noticing small things after that conversation, the kind of things I would have dismissed a month earlier as ordinary forest quirks. My trail cameras near mile marker 7 kept malfunctioning, producing footage with strange gaps in the timestamp, hours missing from the log with no corresponding gap in the physical memory card, as though time itself had been edited out of that stretch of woods. I'd hike that section on patrol and feel a pressure in my ears, subtle but persistent, like the atmosphere itself thickened the closer I got to the creek crossing. And there was the day I found Priya's water bottle. It was sitting in the middle of the trail at mile marker 6.5, in a spot search teams had walked past a dozen times over 3 days of searching. Full to the top, cap screwed on tight, not a speck of dirt on it despite 3 days of rain. I picked it up with shaking hands and stood there in the wet, dripping silence of the forest, feeling watched by something I couldn't locate in any direction I turned to check. That night, back at the station, I ran her name through the missing persons database, out of habit, cross-referencing details for the paperwork. Her entry had changed, not dramatically, just small details shifted. Her hometown listed differently than I remembered logging it. Her emergency contact's name subtly altered. I pulled up my own original intake form to compare and found that it, too, now listed the details I'd just seen in the database, matching exactly, as though my memory of writing it the first time had simply been wrong all along. I sat there staring at the screen for a long time, feeling something crack open beneath my understanding of what was solid and reliable in the world. Chapter 3, Darkness Grows. One went back to Delphine's original comment. I don't like this stretch, and pushed harder than I probably should have, showing up at her cabin on my day off with a bottle of bourbon and a stack of old case files under my arm. She let me in without much surprise, like she'd been expecting this conversation eventually, and poured us both a drink before she started talking. My grandmother worked these mountains as a fire lookout back in the 50s, she said, staring into her glass rather than at me. She used to tell a story about mile marker 7 way before it was even called that, back when the trail didn't have official markers at all. Said there was a stretch of forest that didn't want visitors. Said it had ways of making sure people who noticed too much, asked too many questions, didn't get to keep noticing for long. Ways like what? She never said exactly, but she told me once that the forest doesn't kill people the way you'd think. It doesn't need to. It just. Delphine's hand made a small, helpless gesture in the air, searching for a word that didn't quite exist. It edits them out, takes them somewhere, and then reaches backward and takes the memory of them too, a little at a time, until eventually there's nobody left who fully remembers they existed at all. That's why the case files feel so thin. That's why the photographs don't hold. The forest isn't just erasing the person going forward, it's erasing them backward too. I wanted to laugh at that, wanted badly to dismiss it as an old woman's folktale passed down through a granddaughter's grief-tinted memory. But I was sitting there with a water bottle in an evidence bag that had appeared out of nowhere after 3 days of searching, and a case file whose details had rewritten themselves in front of me, and I couldn't summon the laugh no matter how hard I reached for it. Has anyone ever gone in looking, specifically, on purpose, not searching for a missing person, but searching for whatever's doing this? Delphine's face went very still. My grandmother did. 1961. She hiked in past the marker at dusk, alone, against every piece of advice anyone gave her, because she said she needed to see it for herself. A long pause, the fire popping softly in the hearth beside us. She came back 4 days later, physically fine, but she couldn't remember her own daughter's name for almost a week afterward. Kept calling her by the wrong name, a name none of us recognized, like she was remembering someone else's child instead of her own. It came back eventually, mostly, but she was never quite the same after, and she never went near that trail again as long as she lived. I drove home that night with the radio off, unable to stand the sound of another human voice, watching the tree line pass in the dark on either side of the road like a held breath waiting to be released. 2 days later, I ran into a woman at the general store, a friendly regular named Josephine, who I'd helped rescue a stranded dog for the previous spring. And when I said hello and asked how she'd been, she looked at me with polite, blank confusion. "I'm sorry," she said. "Have we met?" I stood there in the cereal aisle, feeling the floor tilt slightly beneath me, watching someone who had once thanked me with actual tears in her eyes look at my face like it belonged to a total stranger. Chapter 4, Terror. I stopped sleeping properly after that. Every conversation started carrying a low, static hum of dread beneath it. Every familiar face, a question mark I couldn't quite trust. I found myself checking old photographs on my phone obsessively, comparing them against my memory, terrified of finding blurred spaces where people should be. I went back to mile marker 7 3 more times that week, against every rule of the job, against Delphine's increasingly worried texts telling me to stay away from that stretch until we understood more. I told myself I was gathering evidence. The truth was closer to compulsion, a pull I couldn't fully explain even to myself, the same magnetic wrongness that must have drawn Priya to ask about that exact creek crossing before she vanished into it. On the third visit, at dusk, with the light draining out of the forest in slow gray degrees, I heard my name called from somewhere past the marker. Not shouted, spoken conversationally, in a voice that took me a horrified moment to place. My own voice, calling my own name, from somewhere in the trees ahead of me, in a tone I might use if I were greeting myself unexpectedly on the trail. I froze completely, every hair on my body standing up at once, my flashlight beam shaking as I swept it across the underbrush, and found nothing. No movement, no shape, just trees and shadow, and the low, wet sound of the creek running somewhere out of sight. "Hello?" My actual voice came out cracked and small. The forest answered with silence so total it felt deliberate, a held breath waiting to see what I'd do next. I turned to leave, every rational instinct screaming at me to get off that trail before full dark, and that was when I saw the trail camera I'd installed the week before, mounted on a hemlock trunk at chest height, its little red recording light blinking steadily in the gloom. I pulled the memory card that night at the station, hands shaking so badly I dropped it twice before getting it into the reader. The footage showed 6 days of ordinary forest activity. Deer, a fox, wind moving the underbrush, and then, at 6:47 that evening, it showed me, standing exactly where I'd been standing, flashlight raised, calling out into the dark. Except the footage showed a second me standing 8 feet behind my own position, silent, watching, its face turned slightly away from the camera at an angle that made my stomach drop through the floor. I watched that clip 11 times before I made myself stop. The next morning, Delphine called the station in a state I'd never heard from her before, voice tight and thin with barely controlled panic. She told me a name I didn't recognize at first, Grant Oyalaran, and it took me a full 3 seconds of confused silence before the memory surfaced, foggy and distant, like something I'd read about rather than lived through. "He was the one before Priya," she said. 18 months ago. I told you about him, Callum. We talked about the anniversary just last week. I had no memory of that conversation at all. None. A blank space sat exactly where it should have been. Smooth and seamless. No ragged edges to indicate anything had ever been removed. "Something's happening to you," Delphine said, her voice dropping to something close to terror. "You need to leave the station. Tonight, the first minute, I told her I would. I didn't mean it even as I said it, and some small, cold part of me suspects she knew that too." Chapter 5. The Truth. I went back to my grandmother's old journals that night. Not Delphine's grandmother, mine. A woman who'd homesteaded near the edge of this same forest back in the 1940s and kept detailed diaries that had passed down to me in a box I'd never fully gone through. I don't know what made me think to look there. Desperation, maybe. or the same pull that had drawn me back to mile marker 7 3 times against my own better judgment. I found an entry from 1948 that stopped my breath entirely. She wrote about a hollow deep in these woods, a place the local tribes had apparently warned early settlers to avoid. A place where, according to what she'd been told, the boundary between what exists and what's remembered ran thin enough to tear. She wrote that the forest there didn't take life the way predators or accidents did. It took continuity. It reached into a person and pulled loose the threads, connecting them to everyone who knew them, one thread at a time, until the person simply came unstitched from the fabric of every life they'd touched. She wrote, in handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady across the final pages, about a husband she'd apparently had before my grandfather, a man named Thaddeus, married in 1946, vanished near that same hollow in the autumn of 1947. She wrote his name over and over in the margins, like she was afraid of forgetting it even as she wrote it down, like the forgetting was already actively happening, even as she fought against it with ink and paper. The last entry, dated just weeks before she apparently remarried my actual grandfather, read simply, "I can't remember his face anymore. I know I loved someone before this. I know there was a wedding. But when I try to picture him standing in the doorway, there's only an empty space where he should be, and I'm the only one who even remembers there was supposed to be someone there at all." I sat in my kitchen at 2 a.m. with that journal open in front of me, and I understood, with a horror that settled into my bones like cold water, exactly what had been happening to this land for at least 80 years, probably far longer, dressed up in each generation's language for things they couldn't otherwise explain. Delphine's grandmother had glimpsed it and barely escaped with her memory intact. My own grandmother had lost a husband to it so completely that even she, the person who should have remembered him most, could no longer picture his face. And now it had noticed me, had already perhaps begun the slow work of unstitching me from everyone who knew my name, starting small, a stranger's blank look in a grocery store, a conversation with Delphine that had left no impression at all, a second version of myself standing silent in the trees, watching, waiting, already part way toward replacing the original. I understood, finally, why Priya had asked about that creek crossing with such specific, eager curiosity. I wondered, with a dread I couldn't fully name, whether something in these woods had already been calling to her for weeks before she ever set foot on the trail, using a voice she trusted, using words that felt like her own thoughts, drawing her steadily toward mile marker 7, the same patient way it now seemed to be drawing me. Chapter 6, Final Nightmare. I drove to mile marker 7 one final time before dawn. Not because I wanted to, but because some part of me, no longer entirely under my own control, had decided the question needed answering, and I'd stopped being able to tell where my own will ended and the forest's pull began. The creek crossing looked exactly as it always had in the gray pre-light, water moving cold and clear over smooth stones, hemlocks standing close and silent on either bank, mist curling low along the ground like something breathing. I stood at the marker with my flashlight off, letting my eyes adjust, feeling that same ear pressure thickness in the air Delphine had described weeks ago, and I called out into the trees, my voice sounding strange and small against all that silence. "I know what you are." Nothing answered at first. Then, from the mist ahead, a shape resolved itself slowly out of the gray. Not menacing exactly, not monstrous, in any shape I could point to and name, but simply wrong. A silhouette that held itself like a person while moving like something considerably older than the concept of bodies. When it spoke, it used my own voice again, gentle, almost kind. "You already understand," it said. "That's rare. Most people just feel the pull and follow it without asking why. Why do you do this? What do you get from it?" "Continuity is heavy," it said, and for a moment something in its tone sounded almost tired, almost sympathetic. All those threads, connecting each person to every other person who ever loved them, remembered them, waited for them. It's a weight. I only make it lighter, a little at a time. Nobody even notices what's missing. In the end, that's the mercy of it. That's not mercy. That's erasure. Everyone gets erased eventually, it said, stepping closer. And I felt that magnetic pull sharpen into something closer to gravity, closer to inevitability. I just make it happen a bit sooner and a bit more completely for the ones who wander close enough to notice me noticing them back. I don't remember deciding to run. I only remember the forest tilting sideways around me, branches tearing at my jacket, my own ragged breathing loud in my ears as I fought my way back down the trail toward my truck, the pressure in my skull building with every step like something trying to reach inside and start pulling threads loose right then and there. I made it out. I got in my truck, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key, and drove straight to Delphine's cabin as the sun finally broke gray and reluctant over the ridgeline. She opened the door in her robe, hair disheveled from sleep, and looked at me standing on her porch with an expression of polite, careful confusion that I recognized instantly, that dropped my stomach through the floorboards beneath my feet. "Can I help you?" she said. "Are you lost, Delphine?" "It's Callum. I'm sorry," she said, kindly, the way you'd speak to a stranger who'd wandered onto your property by mistake. "I don't think I know that name. I'm writing this down now, fast, in the back office of a station that still has my name on the duty roster, though I've noticed that roster gets harder to read every time I look at it. The letters of my own name blurring softly at the edges, like an old photograph left too long in the light. I don't know how much time I have left before whatever's happening finishes what it started at that creek crossing 3 weeks ago. If you're reading this, and you somehow still remember who I am, I need you to understand one thing before that stops being possible too. It doesn't just take you. It takes the space where you used to be, and it's very patient, and it's already good at wearing my voice."